So in this day and age, whether it's in the United States, whether it's here in India, there's a lot of talk around mental health, loneliness, and of course, the use of social media, particularly use of social media by kids. How does one sort of prepare for all of this? Whether you're a young person and if you have a child, how do you regulate that for your child? If you're an elderly person, who has no immediate family next to you, then how do you deal with the pandemic of loneliness? To try and discuss all of this, I'm joined by a very, very special guest in this exclusive interview here on CNN News 18, Dr. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States of America. Thank you so much for speaking with us here.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we're doing this.
So let's start off by asking you, why are you here? What are you doing here? What's going on?
Well, I'm in India to focus on an issue that's of great importance to both the United States and India and much of the world, which is the issue of mental health. Mental health is not something I learned a whole lot about in medical school. It was something I had to learn much more about afterward, because in our health system we tend to focus a lot more on physical health. But what we've learned over the years is that mental health is just as important as our physical health. And now's the time for us to really do more to ensure people who need treatment can get it, to make sure we can speak more openly about it, but also to ensure we're getting at the root causes of what's driving so much of the mental health strain and struggle across the world.
And one of the things about mental health is it can affect you whether you're a young person, you're a family man, you're a senior citizen. It's almost agnostic that way.
Yeah, mental health can impact all of us, just in the same way that anybody can sprain an ankle or hurt your back. We can all have moments in our life where we struggle with our mental health, and that includes me. I'm no different. I've had periods in my life where I've struggled with my mental health and well-being, and especially when I was younger. And at those times, ages, I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know that it was okay to speak about it. But this is, it turns out, a more universal struggle. And the quicker we're able to start looking at it, just like we do physical health, and the more that we get people to speak up and share their stories without shame or stigma associated with it, the more readily we can get people ultimately the help that they require.
So one of the things is exactly that people are still not open to the idea that you can talk about your problems, or talk about the fact that you're not feeling great, you're feeling depressed. And especially the older you are, the more difficult it becomes to have these conversations. So how does one address that?
Well, this can be very difficult. And I remember certainly growing up in the Indian American community in the United States, there was a lot of stigma around mental health. And that was true for many communities in the United States. And there was a time, in fact, where I had an uncle who lost his life to suicide, and I was actually the one who got the call. I was at home in high school at that time, in 12th standard, received the call that they had found him. And I remember being very confused at that time of how to even think about what had happened, how to talk about it. There was this cloud of shame that descended on our family after that, and we didn't know how to speak about this to others or whether this would reflect poorly on our family. So there was a lot to work through, but one thing that I've seen help is that whenever one person stands up to speak more openly about what they're going through, even if that's reaching out to a friend to share their struggles, that gives permission to other people to be open as well. The more in our schools we're able to speak openly about mental health and treat it just like we would physical health, that sends a message to students that this is okay for you to talk about. And the more we see leaders in businesses and organizations standing up to say, look, we want to support people in their mental health. This is just as important as your physical health. That creates a culture that's more open to addressing mental health concerns.
One of the issues that you're very passionate about, and you've been talking about it for quite some time now, is loneliness, particularly when elderly people who feel lonely when they've lost a spouse. And this can happen again at the other end of the spectrum. Younger people are now pushing back marriage and starting a family. So there is also a loneliness epidemic amongst the young, as there is amongst the old. Again, how does one cope with living life alone?
Well, loneliness is very interesting. If you look up most textbooks of medicine, you don't see a lot of discussion about issues like loneliness and isolation. But one of the things that we've come to realize as we pull the curtain back on this issue is two critical things. One is that loneliness is extraordinarily common, much more so than we would realize. In the United States, we have 1/3 of adults who are struggling with loneliness, and more than 50% of young people are struggling with loneliness. And this is true in many other countries as well. But the second thing we've now learned about loneliness is how consequential it is for our health. That when you struggle with the sense of being socially disconnected from other people, it increases your risk of anxiety, depression, and suicide, but also your risk of heart disease, of dementia, of premature death. So much so that we found that the mortality, the life-shortening effect of social disconnection is comparable to smoking and to obesity, which we think of as classic public health issues, but social disconnection is one as well.
So why is loneliness not a public health issue?
It is.
It should. I mean, you see governments and non-governmental organizations involved and engaged in the malaise of loneliness as much as they are, let's say, fighting tobacco or, you know.
So we have to make loneliness as important a public health issue as issues like tobacco and obesity. And that's one of the reasons during my time as Surgeon General, I've issued the first Surgeon General's advisory specifically on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation to help raise the importance of this issue. When we recognize the consequences of it to physical and mental health, then we understand why it's so important to take action. But finally, it's important to recognize the impacts of loneliness and isolation go well beyond health. We know that it has an economic impact as well, that in the workplace, when people struggle with loneliness, it impacts their engagement, their creativity, their retention and productivity. In schools, when kids are struggling with loneliness and isolation, it also impacts their academic performance and how they do overall. And finally, when you look at communities that are more socially connected, you find that they're not only more economically prosperous, but they also have lower rates of violence. So it turns out that our connection with one another, the social fabric of our communities, is a fundamental element of our well-being. And when we don't invest in that, then what we see is across the board, we will struggle in health and in non-health domains.
One of the other issues you've been writing about is about the influence of social media platforms and overuse of cell phones, particularly among young people, children. You feel that social media companies are not fully, keeping their side of responsibility by not saying that children should be kept away from certain content or certain amount of social media regulation is required for kids. Can you elaborate on why you believe the onus is more on the companies?
Well, first we have to step back and recognize why this is important for kids. What we see is that when adolescents, young people are using social media for 3 hours or more a day, that's associated with a doubling of risk of depression and anxiety symptoms. We also see on studies that young people themselves are telling us about the harms. Nearly 50% of adolescents are saying that social media makes them feel worse about their body image. We also know that a third of adolescent girls say they feel addicted to social media. And the harms are coming not only from harmful content that kids are getting, but it's also coming from the addictive features that companies build in that prey on the developing brains of adolescents to lure them into excessive use that comes at the expense of sleep, in-person time, physical activity, and learning. So these harms are significant. They've been building over time, but what has not been building is a response to it, right? And this is why I have called for strong responses to make social media safer from a public policy perspective, but also for us to change how we approach this as a society. And that includes companies stepping up and taking more responsibility to make their platforms safe. Now,
how would you do that? Could you elaborate? Like, what is it that you want these social media platforms to say or display on their pages that would make it a little more friendly for kids?
Well, the social media companies, I think, are aware of the safety concerns that many families have. What I would like is the following. Number one, for them to be transparent about the data they have, about the impacts on the mental health of kids that their platforms are having. And right now, independent researchers say they cannot get full access to the data. As a parent, I do not want to feel that a company is hiding information from me about the impact of their products on my children. The second thing companies can do is they can look at the algorithms that they have which feed content to our kids and to all users and ensure those algorithms are not directing harmful content to children. I have myself sat down with so many parents over the years who have lost their children to suicide after their child was fed content on the algorithm on social media which directed them to harm themselves and in some cases walked them through how to do that. That should never happen, but it still happens today with no accountability or consequences. And finally, the third thing I would like companies to do is to not only put safety measures in place, but to be transparent about the impact those measures are having. It's one thing to say I'm taking 10 steps to protect children. The real question is, are they working? Right? Right now, the entire burden for managing the harms of social media has fallen on the shoulders of parents and children. Mm-hmm. And this is an impossible task for parents because number one, they didn't grow up with this technology. And if you give them 50 different options, how to manage those is not always simple. I'll tell you, in my own school community, I have 2 children myself, and as parents, we all talk. And one of the parents recently said that she had given a phone to her daughter, who is in 7th or 8th standard, and she had set all these parental controls, but she found that her daughter found ways around them. She installed a factory reset on the phone to get rid of a lot of those controls. She managed to maneuver the toggles to open it up and to download apps that her mother had told her she was not allowed to. She would erase those apps before she gave the phone back to her mother at the end of the day. And the reason the mother was able to figure all of this out is because she was a cybersecurity expert. But not every parent is a cybersecurity expert.
Yeah.
And so we cannot continue to tell parents, oh, just manage this entirely on your own. This is a big part of what is contributing, it turns out, to parental mental health stress as well. In the United States, the top 2 reasons that parents say parenting is so much harder now than it was a generation ago are technology and social media. So we've got to step up and do more as a society and not place it entirely on the shoulders of parents.
But if, I'm sure there are non-cybersecurity parents who are watching this program who have kids and who are facing this very real problem of how do you regulate social media for your children, what can they feasibly do?
So it's a good question, and I can tell you, in fact, what my wife and I are planning to do and what we advise other parents to do. And I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so I think I'm like most parents out there. But number one is I would wait to allow your child to start using social media until after middle school. And in terms of age, that would be until around the age of 15 or 16, at least. And I would reassess then based on their maturity, based on the data about the safety of the platforms. The second thing I would do is if your child is already on social media, and if they're using a phone of their own, I would put boundaries around the use of technology to create tech-free zones in their life. And I would do that specifically to protect sleep, in-person interaction, physical activity, and learning. And here's what that could look like. It could look like saying an hour before bedtime, we're all going to take our devices and charge them in the kitchen. And then you can get your devices back the next day, after everyone is ready in the morning. That helps protect quality and quantity of sleep. It also looks like saying when we are all having dinner together, or when you are getting together with your friends, and our friends are coming over to the house, that's a time where we're going to take away devices and you just focus on each other. More and more kids are actually taking it upon themselves to do this. A lot of young people in the United States are not waiting for their parents to intervene, but they're recognizing the impact that social media is having on their own lives. And there are formed movements, the Logoff movement is one of them, to protect space in their life that's free from technology.
So as Surgeon General, when you speak to the American people, and I'm sure you speak to people around the world, how receptive are people to these ideas? Or do they say these are impractical? I mean, kids these days are not going to listen to you. How does it work?
Well, it's a good question. I'll say I have been pleasantly surprised at how overwhelmingly positive the response has been to not only raising the alarm about these issues, but to laying out some pathways forward. And I think the reason is because people across the board have been struggling with how to manage social media for a long time. Parents and children have deep insights into the harm that many of them are experiencing, and they need help. They want help. And if we can offer them simple, practical steps, that can be a beginning in terms of making these platforms safer. But finally, this is one really important thing for parents to remember. Managing this entirely on your own can be really hard. And that's an expectation that parents, I think, have often put on themselves, which contributes to their own stress. This is too hard for any single parent to feel like they can completely handle on their own. What we need to do as parents is actually lean on each other. We need to talk more openly about how we're managing social media and technology more broadly in our kids' lives. And we need to actually join together in making joint agreements about what we're going to do for our kids. If my child comes to me, as so many kids do, and say, if you don't let me open up a social media account, or if you don't give me a phone, I'm going to be the only one in my class who doesn't have one. And then I'm going to be left out and lonely, and is that what you want? That puts parents in a really tough situation. But if a parent can say, actually, no, I've gotten together with 4 other parents in the class, and none of us are allowing our kids to open up a social media account, that actually is much easier for the parent and the child. So there's safety in numbers here, but as parents, the more we can be open about the challenges we're having and help one another, the easier this journey can be.
All right. As a parent and as a Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to be with you today.